people no longer bound by their non-disclosure agreements. What can you now disclose? Story 1: funny story moments after I was unceremoniously fired because my tech skills were found to be insufficient. The bosses who fired me demanded to know the whereabouts of a hugely important computer file I had worked on. I refused to help them. I even cited the exact language of the NDA I was compelled to sign. I am prohibited from disclosing details of my employment with anyone, including past and current employees of the company. I expounded, adding, so as someone who works here, because I don't know, it was a great moment that I still cherish 5 years later, but now I think I can disclose the truth. I only hid behind the NDA language because I had no clue where to find their computer file, or even where to look with computers. Story 2: my graphic designer best friend won my town's design, the Centennial Logo Contest. Despite having never set foot in the town, I worked for the radio station and just did an interview with one of the organizers, where he lamented that there weren't very many entries. So I called my friend and said, "Want in on this?" He said, "Sure," as he lived on the other side of the country at the time. I spent the next day texting him photos of the town for inspiration. Anyway, when he won and they found out he was a professional graphic designer who lived on the other side of the country, they made him and me sign NDAs because the town was afraid people would think they brought in a ringer. Edit. Wow, this kind of blew up. So let me answer some of the more common questions being brought up. 1. What's a ringer? A ringer is professional who's brought into a contest in order to guarantee favored results. 2. Why did I have to sign the NDA? Well, they unveiled the logo at a great big ceremony where they presented the prize money. I think it was a couple $100, and since my friend lived on the other side of the country, he asked if I could accept on his behalf. I wound up not going because we were broadcasting from another event that day, so the mayor accepted on his behalf. 3. Where is this? Canada, a small town in Alberta. That's all I'm comfortable sharing. Story 3: I was a contractor for NASA. I still fully support the agency, but I was extremely bugged when I learned that each separate NASA center, e.g., JPL, Kennedy, Ames, Goddard, hides many of its inventions and breakthroughs from the other centers, so that when HQ is ready to assign a big mission and a lot of dollars to one center, they have a better chance to compete over the others. Look what we invented. Ames can't do this over there. Give us the next moon orbiter. The downside is that there is a ton of reinvention and duplicated efforts going on. Sometimes years of work go down the drain when another center does the same thing faster. My perspective was you all work for NASA, share knowledge, collaborate. I was frequently ordered to tone down anything revealing when speaking to other centers. Story 4: I dug up some ancient bones, gold, and Mycenaean tombs. I couldn't discuss the finds until the institution who ran the archaeological dig could publish the data. You can read about it here. Edit to Adam, a classic student, not the one running the whole dig, but my role in it was very much legal and official, lol. We knew to dig there because there was another tomb next to it, and it's located near a big Mycenaean Bronze Age palace. I only dug there for one summer, but it was a blast. If you're interested in archaeology, you should see if there are any local groups that you can volunteer with. Story 5: I used to do data analysis of revenue management for some big companies. Many companies have no clue about their data or their revenue streams. I'm talking several $1 million of revenue disappearing in the pipeline, and no one knowing what happened with it, or even caring really. There were multiple times I had to inform clients that we had huge gaps in their costs, and we needed to find the missing number somewhere in order to make our final reports correct, and was met with the paraphrased reply, just sprinkle the missing costs over the existing one. We just want the final total to be correct. All the companies cared about if the amount of money they have at the end of the year is higher than at the beginning, and anything that happens in between is inconsequential. I objected at first to my bosses, saying that what we were doing was incorrect, but they said to just do as the client said. In the end, I got disillusioned, and whenever our clients came with requests that made no mathematical or logical sense, I'd just execute as requested and let their analysts figure out later that the analysis they paid 6 figures for was basically nonsense. I didn't care because I had documentation of all their requests and my objections, which were thoroughly ignored. I had a few cases where clients came back disgruntled several months down the line after some in-house analyst had done a deep dive of their data and came up with objections that I had pointed out months before. I'd usually dig up the relevant emails and clear my name. My choice of action was to tell them to pound sand, but my bosses always bent over backwards for clients, so would have to do the cleanup I anticipated. In the end, I learned most of our economy is held together by duct tape and wishful thinking. At most 10 of people working at big companies are competent and carry the bulk of the work, and rarely are the competent ones the ones in charge. Edit, I want to clarify something for everyone who's talking about embezzlement and people lining their pockets. I can assure you that in the data I was working on, this was very unlikely. The money streams I was analyzing went to other companies as costs. So if they had literally disappeared, someone would notice. This missing money was really just a case of utter incompetence. People just too lazy or stupid to properly keep track of what goes where. I'm sure that if we got all the data from partnering companies, we would eventually be able to track everything precisely. We were unfortunately limited to whatever data our clients provided, and we would rarely get data from other companies as they're quite privy about sharing it with third parties. This rant was not about corruption, but rather incompetence. Story 6, when I was fired from Annie Annis in 2010, I signed a 10-year non-compete NDA contract, promising not to detail the baking secrets or work for another pretzel establishment. Well, that ended this year, so now I can run out and start a pretzel store because the secret I was keeping was making pretzels literally requires 2 products, one of them being water and the other a large bag of pretzel meal dust powder. Quite literally anyone with 2,500 can start a pretzel stand and make perfectly fine pretzels. It's not difficult whatsoever. Edit, I signed the letter when I was hired, but I got a copy with my termination letter. Story 7, I think I'm finally ready to let the world know my secret, if you've ever used VeriSite. The loading spinners you see when the report loads aren't waiting for anything. People kept complaining that reports were coming back too fast, so it must not be working right. It doesn't take long to complete a few hundred Google searches simultaneously. So the loading spinner just makes you wait a few seconds longer, so it feels like more is happening. So glad to finally get that off my chest. Bonus fact edit, I also added applying phlebotinum, reticulating splines, and looking for cat memes as random loading messages, but they wouldn't let me do harassing Ted Cruz on Twitter. Story 8, I worked at a small bakery in New York City when I was younger. Every morning the bakery would take their day-old cupcakes and deliver them to a tour company that did in the city tours. The tour company would pass our cupcakes off as cupcakes from Magnolia and significantly much more popular bakery. Star Wars Battlefront 2 EA will have microtransactions. The NDA was signed in 2016. I was getting more and more worried as the release date kept getting closer, and then it happened. The backlash was so strong that EA went down in the history books as most downvoted comment in Reddit's history. Story 9, McDonald's made me sign an NDA regarding a robbery that took place during a graveyard shift. They made me take a polygraph test because they thought my ex and I were involved due to the simple fact that I had stopped by that day to pick up some documents. I was a manager. I had business to do. You, McMurda? Edit, thanks for the silver. 3 edit 2, there are many questions. Some wonder if I made this up. Request details or explanations. They'll give some extra context, and they'll head out. I was around 19 to 20 years old. This was almost a decade ago. I was pretty naive then. By the time I realized this might have been illegal, I mentioned to a co-manager, and she advised me to not bring it up again as to not involve myself in trouble or damage my future job prospects. I worked at a franchise located in a rural area with an almost entire Latino population, where everyone knows each other. I took home some of the weekly schedules and production projections for highlighting. They would make me do this highlighting weekly. The store manager in charge would allow me to do this on a weekly basis. The area supervisor called to tell me I'd have to take a polygraph test. He mentioned that I could decline taking a polygraph test, but I'd be taken off the schedule and I wouldn't be trusted again. The police showed up at the restaurant, picked me up, held me at the investigation building for around 8 hours, and then they sent me home. When I passed the polygraph test, the area supervisor called again to mention that he appreciated that I took the polygraph, glad to hear I passed, and that he would always have my back. I left the job at McDonald's in 2014. At least it makes for a story to tell. I had to sign an NDA to work at this tech company, and am still waiting to accidentally overhear something cool, so I can feel special for knowing something important, but being legally barred from disclosing it. Story 10, I worked at a gym. In the showers, there was yellow shampoo and blue body wash and pump dispensers. I found out that the only difference between the two soaps was the color. Edit, memory jog, as it was 25 years ago. Hand soap was blue, body wash was green, shampoo was yellow, all the same. Edit 2, as funny as the replies are. It wasn't an NDA about soap. It was just a generic employment NDA to protect the privacy of members and business affairs of the gym. Story 11, I used to work for a large gas station chain. I worked at its warehouse where it creates a lot of the donuts. The room was really hot, so we were always sweating. There's some machines where the donuts get glazed in chocolate. They're these small machines. They look almost like a barbecue grill. They always wanted us to be super fast glazing the donuts. Working in a hot room and working at super fast speeds, it was natural for a lot of people's sweat to just drip in the chocolate underneath us. Never eat the chocolate donut from a gas station. Story 12, in the IT world, it is often that the piece of internal software or system that give your company an edge is not quite as huge a deal as it seems. often is not much more than a couple of technologies mashed together to automate things in a way nobody else is doing yet. And those things are fiercely guarded. I had cases where people saw stuff in action and tried to replicate it, but could not because they were missing just one small piece. Story 13 ID, rather not risk it, but let's just say hypothetically that a certain tech company who is a him inside keeps its campuses pretty subpar. I'm talking old, run-down buildings that need dozens of buckets everywhere to catch water every time it rains. They bully companies and the local economy to put up with their horse shot because they know they're too big to hear a no. Hypothetically, edit, I feel like I'm about to get a very angry and legal jargon-filled phone call. Also, I'm leaving horse shot because I think it's funny. Story 14, never had an NDA on this, but if I give too much info, it'll get tagged and likely get in serious trouble. BCBS had a severe security breach back in 2007. If you were with them in a certain area of the country and ever called them the number for help on your account, all of your personal info was caught by a third party. Every caller, every piece of data, they never disclosed this breach. Edit clarification. Story 15, the head shop smoke shop I used to work at sold whippets and nitrous cartridges behind the counter under the guise of being cake ingredients. All someone had to do was walk in and say they were looking to bake a cake. I'm not sure if they still do it, but I wouldn't be surprised. Story 16, I once had to sign an NDA to get a price on a printer for my sign shop. This was a printer that was only sold by one distributor, by the way, so there wasn't even any direct competition on this particular model. I think the gimmick was that if they make a really big deal out of giving you this super secret pricing that you'd be lulled into thinking it was really something special. Edit interesting comment by you Beard Statchman below, who probably has the right idea as to what was going on with this practice. Story 17, their machine doesn't do what they want it to because they designed it and they're not engineers. Also, all investments into their company is investment into a long-term project that they're making out will take way less time than it will. Edit, I'm afraid I never worked for Theranos or Tesla. I actually can't name the company, but it hires 2 people currently. Story 18, I used to work at a zoo. I've had a few. One day electricity failed, so the polar bears and wolves were able to break out of their barbed wire compounds. Zookeeper told me this while I was located in a kiosk that was situated right next to both the wolves and polar bears. Yikes. Luckily, they decided to not test the fences that day. A few baboons escaped. Zookeepers had to shoot one and tranquilize the others. Supervisor told me I would be fired immediately if I called the press. Thanks, a Swedish car brand called us to ask if we were willing to rent them a moose for a commercial. We told them no, we do not rent out our animals. Probably the biggest one of our zookeepers saw that they had too much of a certain rat-like species. He was tasked to shoot them, but didn't have the heart, so he released them into the wild without our supervisors knowing. Few years later, we have reports of these animals actually causing destruction to our dikes. Oops. Had to keep them a secret while working there, but have been working other jobs for a few years now. Edit changed to spelling error, sorry, LGBTQ community. English is not my native language. Story 19, I signed an NDA after negotiating a 6-figure settlement with my mortgage lender. Back in 2013, the bank illegally sold my home. While I was living there and making monthly payments, I discovered this when new owners evicted me and my 3 kids at the time. I thought someone was trying to steal my identity, etc. I spent the next 2 years writing legal documents and had to represent myself in court. The bank owned every legit legal firm I contacted. Also, the first lawyer I hired took my last $7,000 and was promptly disbarred for misconduct with previous cases. I had no money, no home, but I had a laptop, printer, and access to the county court law library. We were about a week away from selecting a jury when we came to a settlement agreement. In the end, each of my kids now in their 20s got an inexpensive new car, and I live at the beach. Which bank, you ask? I can't tell you the name, but might I suggest that it rhymes with case. They settled because they were worried that if the case went to trial, it would become public. Then everyone would know for certain that they had lied, cheated, and swindled to steal homes from hardworking people. The bank would lose when no one took out new loans with them. Edit, I received a posting on my front door. I went to the eviction court and lost because technically the new owners paid for my house. I was given 7 days to move. All my stuff had lived there 13 years or face the sheriff. Had 3 kids. I didn't want the drama of handcuffs, so we packed and moved, then sought relief through the court system. Story 20, my NDA is classified military information. Of course, it's almost 25 years now, so I could tell you about the Battle of Norfolk. We're going to shoot the other guys. Story 21, my best friend worked at a roadside attraction near Chattanooga, Tennessee, called Ruby Falls. There's something else called Ruby Falls elsewhere in the country. It's supposedly a waterfall inside a cave. Of course, the trail to the cave is redone with all sorts of rock brought in from around the world. I think they've owned up to that part now. But the waterfall itself is barely a trickle naturally, and then only in the wetter season. They've run a pipe up there to supplement the falls, hidden by cracks and crevices and cemented over, and powered by a pump off to the side, which you can't hear when the water is splashing down from 100 feet overhead. It's 99 from the city of Chattanooga, or maybe Lookout Mountain Municipal Water Supply, of course, with such a wet area, old electrical wires going back to the Great Depression, and 300 feet underground. It sputters, or shorts out, and stops every now and then. The first rule in the falls room is make everybody leave immediately if the power goes out. Not for safety, but because the fable agreed upon will be shown as fake. Story 22, I used to work for a construction company in rural Texas, and man, we did so much shady. Honestly, my boss was like the Joe Exotic of construction, always calling us the N-word, cussing us out, threatening to fight us. None of our haul trucks could pass a stay inspection because he was too cheap to fix them up. He never paid his taxes on any of the track hose. Anytime the tax man would show up, we would have to drive all the equipment deep into the woods to hide it. He always paid the OSHA inspector off because he knew our shops couldn't pass inspection. We had mountains of scrap metal in the woods, mountains of old oil buckets stacked in the woods. We had an old rail car in the back that was full of oil hydraulic transmission fluid. The cap was off, so when it rained it overflowed and would just drain into the earth. I can't count how many times we would get some equipment in, and he would tell us to dump the fluid into one of the ponds. We always had guys up there trying to sell drugs, and telling you my 3 years there was wild. Story 23, popular dog kennel I worked for would have people leave their dogs for long periods of time. Dogs would stop eating. They wouldn't tell the owners this. People would leave beds and special toys and treat for their pet, thinking they'd get these items, a little slice of home. These items would go in a trash bag, and it would be set aside. Treats would be thrown out. They used the excuse that it created too much laundry and that having personal items in a dog's kennel made them aggressive and protective over their stuff towards both humans and other dogs. Okay, but no, these are people's pets, they're not wolves. Short of making a Facebook post that no one would see, I had no real way of telling the public and risking some bullshit lawsuit. Because I signed an NDA like a dummy, but I told everyone I knew with a dog to tell other dog owners not to send their dog there. Your dog can't tell you what happens when you're not around. Dogs would run into us with their tail wagging because they liked the yard workers, but the conditions overall weren't great. Dogs are so good and loyal, small spaces and loose regulations on how many dogs you can have at once. It still boils my blood when I drive by. Hopefully things there are better now. Edit wow, I hate that this experience was not unique. Not sure what is wrong with some people that they can't take good care of an animal in the absence of someone else watching. And for profit no less, hope all your doggos and cattos are okay. Story 24, well, Facebook moderators could disclose the trauma they've experienced moderating one of the biggest social media platforms in the world. They've witnessed horrific things that you would only ever think could happen in a war. One anecdote was of a woman who saw a man stabbed dozens of times, begging for his life. Usually they don't last long, but the things they see on the job stick with them for years after they quit, and unlike actual Facebook employees, they don't get paid very well or receive much at all in terms of compensation. Cognizant, the company that manages Facebook's moderation, offers them counseling while they work there, but the second they quit, they no longer have access to it and must either deal with the consequences on their own or get the money for a therapist. This S up, and the icing on the cake is the NDA, which means that they would take huge personal risk in warning anybody else about the job. New people signing up think they're getting a cushy job, albeit with relatively low pay, then get slammed in the face with things that no one should have to see, much less interact with as their job. Story 25, I used to work in fine dining in Oklahoma City. Cocaine everywhere. I've personally walked in on several NBA players over the years. Face down in that white girl. Come to mention it, I've seen several of them other guests on the same bathroom counter that their teammates just did a line off of. Personally got to watch Harold Hamm sign his divorce check. $975 million is a whole lot of zeros in a small space. Wild times indeed. Edit for those that may want more stories. I did get to see LeBron covered in toilet paper. Hilarity ensued. Needless to say, she was escorted out. Story 26, it's not an NDA. It's a secrecy agreement with DoD that elapsed after 25 years. I worked as a programmer for the U.S. Air Force on the global USAF budget in 1979 through early 1981. There was a period of time after Reagan became a leading candidate, but before he won the election or took office. Jimmy Carter was a lame duck president, and many senior officers really hated him. During this time, the USAF had flown the B-1, not the B-1B. This was when it was just the B-1. People had spent a significant portion of their careers working on delivering the B-1 program. They really believed in the B-1 as a strategic long-range supersonic bomber. Jimmy Carter hated the B-1. He viewed it as a wasteful, unnecessary, bloated program designed to keep the builders afloat at the expense of the taxpayer. He had canceled the project in something like 77. But a couple of flying examples were available, but never to see service. Reagan loved the B-1. It was everything he loved about our military programs: fast, sexy, high-tech, and better than anything the Soviets had. All of that being said, hey, race, what happened? Jimmy Carter gave explicit orders that the only two, not certain, B-1s currently flying be broken up into parts. The program completely canceled, the engineering materials be archived at the Pentagon, and all funding ended. He wanted direct evidence sent to him that this had happened, in the form of pictures of the broken-up aircraft. Ronald Reagan was informed of this order by sources in our organization. Reagan let it be known that Carter's order was absolutely not to be followed under any circumstances. Now, where do I come in? I was just this guy working on the AF budget. It was a top-secret clearance, mainly because any analyst could correlate money to named projects, both globally and on bases. So one day I'm going over daily reports, and I see this massive new expenditure for, I think, right, Patterson, it's not in the approved project list, it's not in the unapproved project list. So, clearly, it has not gone up to Congress, yet the money is actually in the dispersal. So I go to my boss and I point out it doesn't belong there, so obviously it's a mistake. He agrees, and we reverse it. A couple of days later, all breaks loose when a general officer I had never seen before comes rampaging through the office demanding to know who shorted his funding. Now, at this point, we get hauled into a room, sort of secrecy, and told to fund this maintenance project. What was the project? Pay a huge team of contractors to very carefully disassemble one of the B-1s, drag in parts from other aircraft, show it being crushed, and send pics to Carter. Meanwhile, reassemble the plane and hide both of them inside black hangars. And that was why Reagan was able to have the program restarted literally within days of taking office. The program was fully back online in 1981. Story 27. Their groundbreaking idea was the same one everyone else had 10 years before. Edit, because so many people seem to think so. No, this had nothing to do with Apple. This was some no-name startup that never went anywhere, obviously, and wanted to contract our no-name startup that never went anywhere for IT services. It was all so vague that I don't really remember the details. I mean, I can tell you where we met. I can tell you how hot it was that day. I can tell you what I was wearing. But their big idea, nothing. Story 28, I disclosed to a minority partner that the majority partner owed him $100K. He could have easily received a check for that amount. But he sued for $700K, spent $300K on a lawyer, and got nothing. Story 29, we reused buffet-style food served in a cafeteria that we're supposed to compost and record as waste. The health inspector says anything that's left open buffet-style and serve yourself can't be taken back and repurposed because it's not monitored and could be cross-contaminated or many other things. Nobody should ever eat buffet-style. If avoidable, FYI, but the Fortune 500 company I worked for was unhappy about the money they were losing by composting the food. So they make us keep it and reserve it later or repurpose it into soup or casserole or something. Personally, I never did this and just waited for my boss to leave and compost the food, but others I worked with were too worried about losing their jobs to go against orders. I didn't want to be fired, but felt morally obligated to not feed people food that was meant to be garbage. So I just sneaky tossed it out when nobody was looking because I got paid really well there. We all had to sign NDAs saying we wouldn't tell the media or non-employees about recipes and procedures that covered leftover food and food waste. Eventually, my boss discovered what I was doing, and I stood up to him about not being willing to reuse garbage as food. So we agreed that I'd just quit, because while they could force me not to talk about it, they couldn't actually force me to do something illegal for my job, and I was clearly refusing to do it. Story 30, the $100 million electronic component broker that I worked for shafted me out of $900K in commissions when I was in my early 20s. They assumed I would not have enough money to fight them in court, and they took their shot. I got a lawyer on contingency, sued them, and took home a $500K settlement in 2000. The 20 years NDA recently expired, and they can continue to kiss my until their graves. Story 31, the CEO of a nonprofit I worked at was making $500,000 a year. Not necessary info bound to my NDA, but nonprofits can still totally with income distribution. Edit, okay. Y'all, first off, I know nonprofit doesn't mean no profit, but like some of you said, it bitters your taste of the company when these things happen. It's a tough pill to swallow when starting salary at this company was $40K with a max raise level. After 10 years, like what my boss was at, was $52K a year. This was also a government-funded child welfare program. Edit 2 didn't think I would need this, but here goes. My previous job was starting pay of $27K. CEO was making $65K. She ran the business so well, but had many less employees to manage. There's no broad stroke statement anyone can make that is correct about CEOs and how their pay structure isn't valid for the work they do. My only point is that it's shitty to be struggling to pay bills while the CEO is getting paid so much more. Story 32 Portal 3 was in development at some point, got a tour of Valve in 2013, and got to see a very early stage of the game. Pretty sure it's not coming out anymore. Story 33, the higher-ups in a company I worked for several years ago, had a non-verbal agreement among managers to not hire black people. It was in an area with very low African-American population, but the fact that the VP slipped that to me on a night out with coworkers was surprising. Story 34, I was in the military from 07-09. The unit I landed in had the second highest suicide rate and the lowest reenlistment rate out of any unit in the entire military. 3 people jumped from the 3rd deck of the barracks, and I got a table thrown at me the day I got to the unit. On a training exercise, I got kept awake by a rotating shift of people for 5 days straight. Our NCOs poured salt water down the barrels of our cannons. So we would have something to do. I had to walk around a convoy of vehicles for 4 hours while everyone else got to sleep because I missed a platoon meeting that I didn't even know existed. I got pulled off a firing range, so I wasn't there for the briefing. I stood 2 separate firewatch shifts in one night because I didn't have my gear 15 minutes before platoon formation. It was in the back of my Humvee that admin took to go get us chow. I wasn't present when they said to get you gear out. Last I'd been told was to leave it there. The corporal basically threw me under the bus. The of that one is if ID kept my mouth shut and not gone to him with a problem ID, have been fine as the Humvee with my gear and got back in time. 3 NCOs came in my room to harass me for having some discoloring on my camis, and it almost turned violent, especially when I told them I didn't have the money to replace them. Punched an oak bookshelf instead. Broken pinky. A corporal told a PFC to go get the MRE heaters out of a trash bag. PFC basically said, LOL, am eating and didn't do it. Corporal then told me to do it while I had a spoonful of food in my mouth. I paused, looked at him, and he then tackled me to the ground and grabbed me by the neck and was choking me. At this point, I pulled out my knife to gut that. Our gunnery SGT pulled him off me just in time. It eventually got to where I didn't trust anyone in my unit, and they had to separate me. They gave me an honorable discharge in exchange for keeping my mouth shut for 10 years about everything that went on. Edit 1 forgot to mention the time when they had us fill out pre-deployment screening questions, and 70 of the units said they would kill themselves or not stop a platoon mate from getting killed if they had the ability to. Our staff NCOs were told to rip them all up and stood over us while we filled out new ones to make sure we didn't tell the truth. This would have made the unit be non-deployable, and the funding would have been cut. Edit 2, in the course of this post, it has been pointed out that the NDA wasn't a real one, and that some officer was playing one last mind game with me on my way out. Me as a naive 19-year-old kid who didn't know any better bought that hook, line, and sucker. Edit 3, minor clarity details. TLDR, got an honorable discharge, and what I now know to be fake. 10 years NDA in exchange for keeping my mouth shut about the shady practices happening in my unit. Story 35, I worked at a very beat-up amusement park. I ran the roller coaster. We weren't fancy enough to actually have a real roller coaster, with one stop button and one go button. Instead, it was a shitty 2-story kid coaster, and the brakes were manual. I was one of the 2 supervisors trainer for this ride, because it was very difficult to learn, and you could hurt someone if you weren't careful. There were people who could run the ride, but only 2 people who could actually certify and train others to run it. So we have this hotshot, been working there for 3 months. He tells our boss that he should be a trainer. He know how all the rides work, yada yada. And our idiot boss gives him the go-ahead. So hotshot puts this girl, we'll call her Courtney, on the roller coaster and trains her. It takes a good week to learn the controls, and probably another few days to get comfortable enough to do it by yourself. So I come in for my shift, hotshot waltzes up to me with an eating grin. Guess who trained Courtney on kitty coaster? I couldn't have ran faster by the time I got into the ride. The poor girl was losing her mind. Hotshot loaded up the carts full of people and just left her after a couple hours of training. Courtney has been trained just enough to keep the coaster going slow enough it wouldn't fly off the tracks, but she couldn't stop the coaster itself. Those people were stuck on that coaster for probably 20 to 30 laps when we usually just do 2. I had to sign an NDA after a whole bunch of customers threatened to sue the park. Ending of the story for those concerned, I jumped the tracks. Spider Monkey climbed into the control box and stopped the ride for Courtney and let her take the day for herself. So traumatizing to be poorly trained and risk severely injuring people. BC, some asshat took acid to bite before work and asked for a promotion to be a trainer. And my boss let him. Story 36, that married grocery store manager in his late 40s was, indeed, having with that 17-year-old courtesy clerk in the compressor room. This was 15 plus years ago when I was a person in charge and not yet a full assistant store manager. Our store in the back room had a couple of rooms, upstairs a large room that housed all of our electrical breakers and backup generators, and a room that housed all of our compressors that kept our freezers and coolers running. Both were locked at all times for security reasons. They were accessible only through the back room. The 17-year-old courtesy clerk bagger had worked there for a while. She was not the best worker. She had a habit of disappearing for a half hour or hour at a time. I and the other PICs complained and tried discipline, but the store manager blocked it, so we just dealt with it. Yeah, she was an attractive blonde. I was in charge one night, and we got an alarm that one of the compressors was low. It was my job to check the level, record the compressor number, and turn it in. When I went up to the room, the door was propped open with a bucket. I assumed whoever worked in the room last left it open. If you have never been in a compressor room before, I have to tell you that it is loud. Our store had several diesel engines that powered the compressors. I proceed into the back of the room, come around a corner to see the girl, not quite naked, but not fully clothed, being serviced by our store manager who had left for the day hours ago. Neither saw me, and I hightailed it out of there. I wrestled with what to do. I was worried about my career at the time, so I called the security hotline and made an anonymous call and told them in vague terms what happened and that they should contact me about details, and 100% certain that they knew it was me that called. A couple of days later, the store manager is suspended and am interviewed. The assistant store manager is interviewed, and the PICs, they tell us not to discuss it. So, of course, we did. I was a little late to the party. Almost everyone knew. The store manager would use his store keys to come into the back room, meet the courtesy clerk, and then would hook up in the compressor room. She was not the first teenager he had done this with at this store and others. They fire the store manager, and like an idiot, he sues. Dozens of people are deposed. NDAs are drawn up and signed. He thinks better of it, drops the suit, and that's the last I ever heard of him. The girl quit right after the store manager was suspended.